school leader. At my previous church that I was at about 15 years ago, there was a couple, and they weren't in my Sunday school class, they were in another class, and they had gone to a ball game. They were probably 4 hours or so away from the town we lived in. And it was a late Saturday night, and they drove back and got in really late so they could make their small group, their Sunday school class the next morning. Now, we're in June now. Attendance usually trends downward during the next couple of months because of vacation, kids' ball games and all that. But I'm going to encourage you to make your class something that people won't want to miss. Well, we're starting a new unit of study this week called Never Alone, the Holy Spirit in Our Lives. This is the first lesson. It's called Convicted by the Spirit. And it's out of John chapter 15, verses 26 and 27, and John chapter 16, verses 7 through 15. The point of this lesson is the Holy Spirit convicts of sin and points to the truth of salvation. Well, before diving in, let's talk about some important facts to know about the Holy Spirit. Now, the Holy Spirit is a person. He's a he, not an it, not a thing, not this impersonal force, okay? The Holy Spirit is God. Let's look at this chart here. I've shown this before. This is a chart. This is the best way I have come across to illustrate the Trinity, okay? The Holy Spirit is not the Father. He's not the Son, but he is God. The Father is God, but not the Son, not the Spirit. You see, the relationship, they're unique. They are individual, yet they are one. Still can't fully understand God? Well, that's good, because if you could wrap your mind around God and who he is, then you'd be equal to God. And he is so much more above us, we're not going to be able to completely comprehend him. Now, I mentioned that the Holy Spirit is God, and here are some scriptures that support that statement, okay? In Acts chapter 5, verses 3 and 4, he's called God. He's called the Spirit of God in Genesis 1:2, Judges 3:10. He's considered God in Acts 28:25 through 27, and 2 Corinthians 6:16, and Hebrews 3 verses 7 through 9. He's treated equal to God the Father and the Son in Matthew 3:16, 28:19. He's eternal, as Hebrews 9:14 tells us. He's omnipresent, as Psalm 139 verses 7 and 8 tells us. He's omniscient, as 1 Corinthians 2 verses 10 and 11 says. He was involved in creation, as Genesis 1:1 through chapter 1 verse 2 says. And he also helps us recognize the glory of God, as 2 Corinthians 4:4 says. And then here are some scriptures that point to his being a person. Okay, he's referred to as a person in John 6 verse 63, and John 14:26, and Romans 8:11. He also speaks. That's something a person does. Acts 1:16, 8:29, 10:19, just to name a few. He witnesses, as John 15:26 tells us. He searches, as 1 Corinthians 2:11 tells us. He can be grieved, as Isaiah 63:10 and Ephesians 4:30 states. He loves, as Romans 15:30 states. He has a mind, as Romans 8:27 states. So you have all these different characteristics here. And it's not exhaustive, but it gets the point across that I'm trying to make here, that he is God and he is a person. I'm going to print these scriptures off instead of taking time to look them up and give everybody the sheets of paper and for them to take home in my class, so they can have them to look back from time to time. Maybe they'll keep it. Hope so. If you'd like a copy of this, just click on that link below, and you can download that PDF and print that off. Now, if you're in my church at First Baptist in Whitehall, if you'll email me or text me, I'll print those off for you. Tell me how many you want, and I'll have them in your classroom on Sunday. All right. Well, let's get a little bit of context for our lesson, okay? This is taking place just hours before Jesus' arrest, his mock trial, and crucifixion. Jesus knows exactly what's getting ready to happen to him and the effect it's going to have on his friends. And he wants to assure them that when he is gone, they will not be alone. Now, our first two verses are in John 15, verses 26 and 27, that says, when the advocate comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth, who goes out from the Father, he will testify about me. And you also must testify, for you have been with me from the beginning. So They are to testify or to be a witness of what they have experienced while being with Jesus. Now, Jesus just didn't start talking about the Holy Spirit out of the blue. No, we look back in chapter 14, verses 25 and 26, and it says this: "All this I've spoken while with you, but the Advocate, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and remind you of everything I've said to you." So just moments before our text this week, Jesus had already told them that the Holy Spirit would come to be with them. And let's remember what "in the name" means. Okay, it means with the authority of, like, I come in the name of King Henry. Okay? He comes in the authority of King Henry. Now, I'm going to bring this statement back up here in a couple of minutes. Now, depending on your translation, your word for the Holy Spirit at the beginning of verse 26 may be advocate, counselor, helper, or comforter. The Greek word here is parakletos. And no, that's not parakeet, it's parakletos. The prefix para, P-A-R-A, means alongside of, like a paralegal is one who works alongside an attorney. And the word parakletos means one called alongside to assist another, or an advocate. So hence the different translations of the word. Now, do you see a conflict between verse 26 and back one chapter in chapter 14, verse 26? In chapter 14, the Father will send the Holy Spirit. And just one chapter later, Jesus said he would send the Spirit. Now, one thing to me, this just points out the unity of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Trinity, commonly referred to as the Godhead. Also, Jesus said that the Spirit is from the Father and would proceed from the Father. The Father was in control of the sending. Now, get ready for a very poor analogy, but I think it might help make a little sense here. I purchased a birthday present for my wife back in April, but it didn't arrive until yesterday. And it wasn't because of supply chain or anything like that. It was the latest John Grisham book, which wasn't released until May 31st. So I ordered the book through Amazon.com 2 months ago. And based on that information that I just said, that little scenario, which of the following statements is true? I sent my wife a book. Amazon sent my wife a book. Amazon sent my wife a book in my name, or based on my authority, that is, I ordered the book. You see, all three of those statements are correct. I believe that explains what might seem to be a discrepancy here. So, Jesus promises the Holy Spirit and called him the Spirit of Truth. And this is the same title that Jesus gave the Holy Spirit back in John chapter 14, verse 17, where Jesus told his disciples that the Spirit was with them and would eventually be in them, indwell them. And because of the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, as well as their 3 years of personal experience with Jesus, they would be able to testify, to be a witness concerning Jesus to the world. Now, our next set of verses is down in John 16, verses 7 through 11. Remember, Jesus is preparing them for his death and eventual resurrection and ascension into heaven. And he told them in verse 7 that it was better for them, it was for their benefit that he goes away. Because if he didn't, then the Holy Spirit, the advocate, the counselor, could not come to them. Now, this had to be difficult for them to hear. For us on this side of the resurrection and Pentecost, we understand. But to these guys, I'm sure they were questioning everything Jesus said, because he's been telling about his death for so long, and now he's going to go away. But of course he was right. You see, Jesus, God in the flesh, was limited while he was on earth by time and space. He, just like we, can only be in one place at a time. The Holy Spirit, however, could be everywhere at the same time, comforting all believers at the same time. Okay, but couldn't the Holy Spirit come and Jesus be present on earth at the same time? Well, no, because part of the Holy Spirit's ministry was to testify and glorify Christ, who died for sins, rose, ascended to heaven, and who was going to return. So the Holy Spirit couldn't testify and glorify what hadn't happened yet. Now, the lesson title deals with conviction. And when I hear that word conviction or convict, I think of feeling guilty or being found guilty in a court, like he was convicted on all counts and put in jail. So it's easy for us to understand about being convicted of sin. But being convicted of righteousness and judgment, how does that work? Okay. Well, you can get a better feel for the meaning of a word by looking in several different translations and see how that word's translated. Well, the word translated convict in the ESV, the English Standard Version, is also translated like this in other translations: reprove, show, convince, prove, uncover, and expose. And to me, the NIV makes the most sense to my feeble little mind. It says, when he comes, he will prove the world to be in the wrong about sin and righteousness and judgment. Or what are some wrong ideas the world has about sin, righteousness, and judgment that actually have been held throughout the centuries? Well, that something's only a sin if you think it's wrong, or that, I haven't murdered, I haven't, killed anybody, so I really haven't sinned. How about what's some wrong ideas about righteousness? That, I'm a pretty good guy. My good outweighs my bad, so I'm sure God's going to give me a pass when that day comes. And what about judgment? A wrong idea that is common is hell, if it even exists, is reserved for murderers and very evil people. No way am I going to get, am I going there? So the Holy Spirit will prove to the world that these concepts are wrong. The Holy Spirit is the Spirit of truth. And when we, Spirit-filled believers, proclaim the truth about Jesus, those unbelievers have the opportunity to turn from their wrong beliefs and be saved. Jesus further explains this in the next verse. The Holy Spirit will convince people they are wrong about sin. And the ultimate sin, and the one that sends you to hell, is not having a saving belief, not having a saving faith in Jesus, as John chapter 3, verses 18 and 19 tell us. The Holy Spirit will also convince people that they are wrong about righteousness. Jesus is the only righteous one. 1 Peter 2:22 tells us that. He's the only one who on his own can go and reside with the Father in heaven, which he said he was going to do. Every other person's righteousness are what? They're like filthy rags, as Isaiah 64 verse 6 tells us. The Holy Spirit will also convince people about judgment. Yes, there is a judgment that's reserved for the devil and his angels, as Matthew 25 verse 41 says. So when a person is truly under conviction, when they are truly convinced that their unbelief is wrong, that any righteousness they have won't get them into heaven, they'll realize the punishment for that unbelief is truly a literal hell that was prepared for Satan. Our last set of verses are found in John chapter 16, verses 12 through 15. And here, Jesus lovingly tells his friends that there is so much more to tell them, but they weren't able to handle it then. Not at this time. But when the Holy Spirit comes, he will complete the teaching. He will guide them into all truth. And we see that the Trinity in action here, don't we? As everything the Father has is Jesus's. And the Spirit will declare or teach the disciples from what Jesus has. The Spirit won't manufacture anything up on his own, any ideas on his own, but only what he hears, only what he receives from Jesus, which is ultimately from the Father. Now, I read in one commentary that our text this week explains how we receive the New Testament by combining chapter 14, verse 26, and chapter 16, verse 13. The Spirit would remind them of what Jesus taught. Okay, that's how we got our four Gospels. Then he would guide them into all truth, resulting in the epistles. And then he would show them the things to come, referring to the prophetic scriptures, especially the book of Revelation. So the Holy Spirit's initial job in the life of a person is one of convincing or conviction. So we should live our lives not as the convictor, not as the prosecutor, but as a witness, and testify and allow the Spirit to do his work. Now, other resources you might want to investigate during this study include Jesus Continued by J.D. Greer, by Life in the Spirit by Robertson McQuilkin, The God I Never Knew by Robert Morris, and I don't have it on my desk here, but Forgotten God by Francis Chan as well. Well, we're going to continue in the journey of the Spirit in a person's life by looking next time at Born Again by the Spirit out of John chapter 3. So, don't forget to do what? Pray forward with your class this week. Thank you guys so much for watching.